Professor Hodgson was involved in the founding of the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy, and he was also its General Secretary until 1988. He also co-founded the Other Canon, a center and network for heterodox economics, whose principal founder and executive chairman is the Norwegian economist Erik Reinert. In 2013, Geoffrey Hodgson also co-founded the World Interdisciplinary Network for Institutional Research. The School of Institutional Economics, the paradigm in which Geoffrey Hodgson works, is a leading heterodox approach to economics that presents an alternative to the neoclassical, predominantly ahistorical kind of economics, which has a rather basic and, I would say, empirically inadequate theory of the human subject. So neoclassicists most often define human beings as atomistic, acultural, and anormative pleasure machines who constantly only seek to maximize the utility of all their interactions with their surroundings. Institutionalists, on the other hand, try to understand the complex historical and biological shaping and conditioning of our subjectivities and action orientations. Institutionalists see our motivations and our action orientations as structural and historical phenomena. They focus on the role of social institutions and their historical transformation in shaping human economic behavior. For Hodgson, institutions are the stuff of all social and economic life, and he defines institutions as, quote, the systems of established and prevalent social rules that structure social interaction. And a rule, according to Hodgson, is a socially transmitted and customary normative injunction or immanently normative disposition that individuals have internalized over the course of socialization. Hodgson is also interested in human evolutionary processes which have over millions of years given shape to certain crucial dispositions that are part of human nature. The most important among these are our natural disposition to be moral beings, to have moral intuitions, which means to respond normatively, or as Weber would say, value rationally to the outside world, and not only to respond in terms of maximizing our pleasure from interacting with the world, as well as, for example, our disposition to obey authority. It is also, as Geoffrey Hodgson says, evolutionarily hardwired in us. Today's lecture bears the title, What is Capitalism? The understanding of the nature of capitalism, its dynamics and weaknesses, is the central aim of Geoffrey Hodgson's most recent work, Conceptualizing Capitalism. In Hodgson's view, one cannot understand capitalism, debate it, let alone criticize it, without first appropriately defining it. And much of the work is devoted to a proper definition of capitalism. That's the central aim of the work. For Hodgson, the task of providing a clear and precise definition, the task of what he calls conceptual precision, is of paramount importance in the social sciences. He, for example, endorses Confucius's ancient maxim that if names are not right, words are misused, and when words are misused, affairs go wrong. So the task of formulating precise definitions is too often left unfulfilled by social scientists, not least due to the contemporary anti-essentialist spirit of much of social science, which is, for example, characteristic of much of postmodernism in social sciences. Geoffrey Hodgson devotes some attention to this anti-essentialist spirit, and he considers it misguided. For him, for example, defining certain properties as essential to a certain phenomenon does not automatically mean that we are metaphysicists, in the sense that we are treating those properties as somehow trans-historical and unchangeable. So there is an important conflation there between epistemological and ontological grounds, and Geoffrey Hodgson makes an excellent argument in favor of what he calls anti-essentialism. So the term capitalism is, of course, one of the most commonly used in social sciences, politics, and public discourse, yet one of the least clearly defined and understood. For example, capitalism is often defined simply as a combination of private property and market. However, this would mean that capitalism has existed since antiquity, since markets, commodity exchange, and private property have been around for thousands of years. They were there in ancient Greece and Rome. The question then, from an institutionalist perspective, is what historically are the key societal institutions that have contributed to the emergence of capitalism, and what are its most important differential characteristics. And as you will see, Hodgson stresses in particular the importance of the state and modern law for the emergence of modern capitalism in the 18th century. So there is nothing natural, necessary, or eternal about capitalism, Hodgson argues. It is a socioeconomic formation that is historical and that has evolved historically for contingent reasons. So much of Hodgson's work also revolves around criticism of these assumptions about the natural kind, that capitalism is natural in a way, is an extension of human nature. But he's also very critical of Marxists, primarily of their neglect or even contempt for modern law as a crucial factor in the development of capitalism. As you all know, for Marxists, law is very superstructural in nature. And finally, Hodgson stresses, like Schumpeter before him, the seminal role of banking in the formation of capitalism. And he also discusses one of the most important characteristics of capitalism, which is inequality, as you will hear. So he considers that capitalism engenders inequality intrinsically, as it results from the fact that the nature of assets owned by capitalists, for example machines, is very different from the nature of property owned by workers, that is labor. And without further ado, I would like to give the word to Professor Hodgson.
It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first visit to Belgrade and to Serbia. Peter's been trying to organize this visit for some time. I'm very pleased I'm able to come and talk to you. Previous speaker gave a really excellent summary of my arguments. It makes my job much easier. I can perhaps go a little bit quickly through some pieces of the argument. Why talk about capitalism? Well, the term used to be unpopular. It used to be only critics of the system would use the term. So leftists would use the term. But these days it's in common currency. People talk about advocate capitalism or criticize capitalism. And there's also a concern about capitalism because we've seen that one of the biggest crises in the system in 2008, since the 1930s. There's been crises before. So there's big question marks being raised about the future of capitalism, both in a moral sense, about is it desirable to continue with it, and also in the sense of can such a system, which is clearly unstable in some ways, survive for the 21st century. I discuss those questions in the book later, but I want to focus on the preliminary definitional task at the beginning. It may seem a bit boring. Some people get bored with definitions and trying to get the exact words, but I think it's essential. I think to understand this system, once you focus on the key attributes, you actually get, you begin to get an understanding of what we're talking about. But anyway, I'll proceed. In economics today, we're told that mathematics is important, and I agree, mathematics is very important. Mathematics has taught us a great deal, both in terms of modeling technique and also in terms of statistical estimation through econometrics. And one of the arguments for mathematics is it offers precision, which it does. I'm trained as a mathematician. I know that if you set up a model, you have to be very careful how you define your terms and define the mechanisms of the model, and if you get it wrong, the model doesn't work and it doesn't make sense, and so on. So it's a very useful training, and I don't bemoan that within economics. I think it's important. But I think there's another side to the story, and that's conceptual precision. And here economics, and to some extent the other social sciences as well, I think are in a big mess. I'll give you some examples. Economists can't agree on definition of the firm. Okay? The theory of the firm was a popular sub-discipline or sub-debate within economics. It sort of started, slow start with Ronald Coase's famous 1937 article on the nature of the firm. Didn't really take off until the 60s and 70s. People will first ask the question, what does the firm do? What's it maximizing? Is it maximizing profits or sales or whatever? And then they looked to more internal questions about the nature of the firm again, rediscovered Coase. And so you had classic articles like Auchian and Dempset's and Williamson's work, a rediscovery of Coase's work and extension by Coase himself. So in the 70s and 80s there was a huge flowering of interest in the theory of the firm. But even to this day, we don't agree on what a firm is. So how can you have a theory of the firm when we don't know what a firm is? Okay, we don't agree what we're talking about. We have a theory about talking about something that we don't yet know what we're talking about. Even a market, there's contested definitions of a market. I'll come to that in a minute. On what exactly we mean by market. Are there such things as markets for ideas? I think that's a misleading notion, and at best it's a kind of metaphor. Even property, there's a dispute about the meaning of property. Do I own this microphone because I control it? If I ran away with this, would it be mine? According to the economics of property rights, yes, it would. But I say I have no legal title to this. It's owned by this institute. So whether I stole it or left it here, it's still the property of the institute. So notions of property are also contested. And capitalism. We have different definitions of capitalism. Now one of the problems that makes it different from mathematics is in mathematics we accept the axiomatic method. We accept that if you define something like a set or a group or a function, okay, everyone says, right, I accept your definition, what follows from that? And then we follow through the logical steps, and the whole of the discussion is about the logical steps. It's not about the basic definitions at the beginning, as long as they're coherent. The problem with defining concepts of real phenomena is there's no rule book for doing so. You can't say this is the correct definition of the firm, okay, because it's a means of communication. You can say, I would try and persuade you that this definition of the firm is better than another definition. That's fair enough. But you can't say, this is correct. Okay? Simply because it's a question of establishing consensus about meanings of words rather than doing mathematics. So we have markets, we have confusion about what markets are. And this is the Confucian quote which you mentioned, which I'll skip over. So, capitalism. So if you look at the dictionary, what does it say about capitalism? Well, the most important, in English language, the most important dictionary is the Oxford English Dictionary, and the compact version is, as it says, the compact version. It's an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners of profit rather than by the state. It doesn't mention markets, but it just talks about trade, so it's private ownership and trade. Very similar in the New Encyclopedia Britannica, again another iconic reference work in British culture. Capitalism is an economic system in which most of the means of production are privately owned, and production is guided and contributed largely through the operation of markets. Okay. And as the speaker said, the problem with this is that it gives us an enormous historical compass. And Deirdre McCloskey, you've probably heard of Deirdre, very brilliant economic historian. She's writing a book about the rise of capitalism. She doesn't use the word capitalism, she talks about the rise of the bourgeoisie. Classic trilogy, the third part has just come out. So she uses the word capitalism, even though she's an economic historian, very, very widely. So market participants are capitalists. Okay, there's an ambiguity about what you mean by market here. Is it a narrow definition or a broad definition? But if there is a market, according to her, we're capitalists. And the market economy has existed since the cave. So basically she's saying there's two definitions being played at here. One is the market, and the other one is capitalism. And for her, the market is any old trade. Okay, so trading in stone axes 10,000 years ago is a market. And capitalism is coextensive with the markets, same thing, so capitalism has existed for tens of thousands of years. Okay, now the problem I have with the market argument is actually we ought to distinguish between markets and trade, because trade is quite different. Trade 10,000 years ago for stone axes across Europe was very occasional. It was very important that it happened, certain commodities moving across large distances, but it was typically between tribes and it was sporadic. And that's not the same as a stock market. It's a regular, high-powered, high-volume transaction forum where lots of things are exchanged quickly. So we need to sort that out. Those terms have to be sorted out. And another issue, a side issue, which stimulates discussion here is that since the end of the Cold War, so the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, and things happened in Yugoslavia as well, so you have separation of Yugoslavia, split up the former former Yugoslav Federation. That changed the discourse. It not only changed the world, but it changed the discourse, because instead of saying there's instead of the world being polarized between two ideal types, basically one focused around the Soviet Union and the other one focused around the United States, we realized that there was a possibility of varieties of capitalism. And some people argued because there's many types of capitalism, we have a problem with defining what capitalism is. And I argue this is a mistake. It's a mistake because the fact that we have a definition doesn't mean that we're saying everything's identical. We can define a mammal as an animal that suckles its young, and elephants, which are big, and mice, which are small, are both animals. So the fact that you're defining something means you're making a classification, and it doesn't mean that everything within that type has to be identical. So I try and sort out some of these problems in some of the discussions which were referred to earlier in debates about essentialism. Okay, so very briefly I'm going to go through this. I can answer questions about this, so I'm not going to dwell in depth on all these arguments. I'm going to throw out some ideas and you can come back to me and ask me to elaborate if you want. First of all, there's in the philosophy of science, there's different types of definition. I've given you one example already of a definition in mathematics. It's an axiomatic approach. You say take it or leave it, and if you take it, the whole object is to follow the logic of the argument. So what you do when you're defining a triangle as something with three sides, you're doing something different from what you're doing when you're defining capitalism. What is the difference is because in mathematics you're making clear-cut axiomatic designations. Now other kinds of definition outside mathematics are concerned with classification. So the job here when we're dealing with terms like market, capitalism, property, is classificatory. We have to work out criteria to decide what is capitalism and what is not capitalism. The boundary may be fuzzy, but you have to have some way of doing that. So it's like the demarcation of one real-world species of entity from another among an empirical ensemble of varied entities. It's very similar to what classification in biology. That's the same kind of definitional task. To define a mammal, for example, or define a species of bird, involves getting those kind of definitions. Now, classificatory definitions have a simple job. It seems simple. It's actually very difficult. They focus on the minimum number of common and essential features of a class of entities. Okay? We don't have to elaborate. We don't need more criteria than the necessary to do the demarcation. So a definition of a mammal is simply one thing: animal that suckles its young. Very simple. It doesn't say anything about skeletal frame, warm blood, 4 limbs, or anything like that. It simply says this is sufficient to demarcate. In the social sciences, it's actually more complicated. So definition is not the same as analysis. It was a classificatory definition is a classification. Okay, it's a way of agreeing on what we're talking about, so that when we're talking about it, we can then analyze it, and we're not talking about different things. Okay, it's prior to analysis. So to criticize the definition because it doesn't include an important aspect of the system, say power or whatever, is could be a misplaced criticism, because then that may be the task of analysis rather than demarcation. Definition is not description, so it's mistaken to criticize the definition because it doesn't describe everything. It's simply demarcation. Okay, so let's get to the task of trying to define capitalism. Again, there's no fixed rule book. I'll give you some reasons why I'm defining capitalism this way, but there's some flexibility in the argument. So you can perhaps modify it or think about it. This is a key piece of empirical information. It's the same piece of information which inspires McCloskey's trilogy on the bourgeois virtues, she calls it. The vertical scale is GDP per capita. in some PVP dollar measure. Horizontal scale is years from 1300 AD to 2000 AD. And what's obvious is this huge explosion in productivity per capita in the leading capitalist countries. 4 countries there, Italy, Netherlands, UK and USA. Why they're chosen? Because at various points in time, they were the leading countries. The first proto-capitalist country was Italy. So capitalism in little enclaves developed in Italy with the financial system, even with factories and so on. That's there. The Netherlands got ahead, and the UK got ahead, and the United States got ahead. Other countries then caught up, or were catching up afterwards. Even developing countries show growth after this period. Perhaps not adequate to deal with all problems of poverty, but nevertheless, this was a major change which occurred. In McCloskey, of course, this is the hockey stick graph. So there's a problem of explanation. Why did it happen? And there's a problem of defining what this period is to the right of this graph. Okay? And I think there's good reasons to think about the capitalism being the right-hand side period. Because we're associating capitalism with a system driven by money and various other reasons, which I'll elaborate another. So we could say, let's prima facie call this capitalism. We don't have to have an exact date. The capitalism is born on February the 19th, 1742. That's silly. Capitalism develops in little enclaves and then spreads and reconfigures and then grows and then becomes dominant. Now, what caused this explosion? Well, of course, something to do with it is technology. We have canals, steam engines, later electrical power. All this productivity growth required machines, it required communications, means of transportation of goods and materials, etc., etc. All those things are important. So is it basically technological? Well, it is technological, but on the other hand, you have to explain technology. Why did those inventions, why did those developments occur at that period? Now, for this reason, personally, I'm an institutionalist, because I think to understand how technology takes off and why were steam engines developed, because they weren't invented, the ancient Greeks invented them, but why were they developed and commercialized and engineered, invested in, spread? I mean, look at the inventor of the modern version of the steam engine, James Watt, a Scotsman from the United Kingdom. He was a businessman. He required finance. He required backers. He had a firm called Bolton and Watt, and Bolton was a financier. And they went around the country and they acted as agents, selling their steam engines, installing them in mills and factories and so on. So it was an enterprise which required institutions, it required finance, it required property rights, it required patents, it required all these things. And before that, the science that had to go on in the Enlightenment here to get the technology going required a political system where people were not persecuted for saying things that might upset the church, okay? And people used to be burnt at the stake for suggesting that the earth was not the center of the universe, okay? If you're going to be burnt at the stake for a simple scientific hypothesis or ontological claim about the positioning of the earth in the universe, then science has difficulty, okay, because it's persecuted by religious authority and political authority. And that had to change to at least to a major degree for science to get off. So the Enlightenment is crucial here. And the Enlightenment wasn't just a flowering of ideas, it was very much that, but it also was a change in political tolerance in various parts of Europe, particularly northwestern Europe, which enabled scientists to think about these things, to do experiments relatively unmolested by religious authority and political authority. So all those institutions, political and financial, had to change in this period for this technology to take root and the productivity to take place. Okay? So the question then, the analytical question, is what unique institutions occur here to create the preconditions for this takeoff? So if capitalism is defined in institutional terms, that's my argument, we should define it in institutional terms. If that's the case, then we have to see something happening here which is new, relatively new, which enables this takeoff to take place. So that's the search, that's the definitional search. Before then, those things were less prevalent, and after then they get established and they're more prevalent. Okay? So that's one reason why it can't be markets and private property alone, because markets and private property are pretty well established here. Okay? Not necessarily secure all over Europe, there's confiscation and so on, but actually in England they were relatively secure. Property rights were relatively secure about here. Okay? Douglas North is wrong, I'll talk about that later, about the insecurity before 1688. Right, so markets. They've existed for more than 10,000 years, but much of the trade was ceremonial and between tribes. So if we have a narrow definition of market, which is the definition in most languages, okay, I don't know any Serbo-Croat, but I guess the equivalent for market in Serbo-Croat is a place where things get exchanged. You have a fish market, a vegetable market, a stock exchange. These are places. Now on the internet we can use cyberspace, okay, but there were spaces in Greek. The Greek for market is agora, which means open space, okay, and it's a place where people traded according to rules. So if you define markets more narrowly, then they arrive very early in China, which is ironic because we call China an emerging market, which is a bit of an insult to the Chinese. But closer to home, we have much records of markets emerging about 6th century BC. From the Bible, from Herodotus, and this is in the area of the Levant, modern-day Syria, which is in place in a mess at the moment, but it's foundation of much early institutional development, and also in Babylonia and Greece. And incidentally, the development of coinage was crucial in the emergence of those markets, which is another story. Coinage had just been invented beforehand. Now, there's a dispute whether ancient economies like Greece and Rome were market economies. Karl Polanyi, the famous Hungarian who lived in America and wrote the book Great Transformation, and his colleagues argued they weren't market economies. Modern scholarship actually has swung in the other direction. There's evidence for markets being influential in Greece and Rome. That's a historical argument, but we have strong evidence about at least their existence. And the markets were very important in Europe from the 13th century. Okay, well-defined property rights. Well, I touched on this a bit earlier. The Douglas North argument, Douglas North sadly passed away a few months ago, famous for this argument about, he was trying to explain he didn't use the word capitalism so much, but the sort of the growth of a modern market economy, and focused on 1688, the Glorious Revolution, as the key turning point. The problem with this is first of all, the notion of property is too loose. And in a sense, property rights were well established beforehand. The problem with them was the feudal nature of those rights. For example, the nobility in England had pretty secure property rights in their land from the 13th century. That if you were a noble owning vast tracts of land, you would have secure property in it by law. The legal system would work more or less in your favour if you had legitimate right to it, but you couldn't sell it. You couldn't use it. You couldn't use it to mortgage, and the reason for that was your firstborn son had a claim to that property. That's called an entail. Okay. So this sort of tangled feudal nature of property would mean that the lord, the owner, actually owned the property, but the rights over it were limited. In the limited alienation rights, as they're called in law, the right to sell. And this was the problem. It wasn't a security of property, it was getting rid of these entails. And this happened very gradually, and didn't, 1688 had no obvious effect on it. So this is another argument to go into. If you look at the data, we have data on this, the commercialization and collateralization of land, that's using land as a means of financing other projects. borrowing money using land as collateral and then investing that in other projects like building canals, it's late 18th century rather than 1688. So the well-defined property rights argument is not without some importance, but it's too early and too late in the English case. It's too late in the sense because property was established long before, and it's too early because property couldn't be collateralized, couldn't be used to finance industry or investment, generally until much later. Okay, so another demarcating definition. Property doesn't work as a demarcating definition for capitalism. Is it wage labour? Okay, Marx had a lot of insight, of course, about the nature of capitalism, but he saw the class relationship between labour and capital as the core of the system. Okay? There's some quotations which I won't read out, but basically he's arguing here that if we date the rise of capitalism from the point at which the capitalist class grows to a point which is employing large number of workers, and this happens in the Mediterranean, which it did. It happened in Florence, 14th, 15th century. The capitalist era dates from the 16th century, so he's making the claim the 16th century, which is time of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I in England, is the foundation of capitalism from this point of view, from the point of view of the wage-labour relationship. But again, the data create problems for this. But first of all, wage labour was strong in England for a long time for that, more than 100 years before. After the abolition of serfdom, or decline of serfdom in England, after the Peasants' Revolt and the Black Death, there was a general conversion process to wage labour. By about 1400, it was quite general. So in 1688, that's a coincidence, it's the Glorious Revolution, it's the date of a particular survey. More than half of heads of families were labourers, and it concurs with Marx, but they're not industrial labourers. So industrial labourers are as small as 21%, even in the early 19th century. So this data shows that Marx's criterion is a little bit ambiguous. Does he mean wage labour and agriculture, or does he mean industrial labour? If it's wage labour and agriculture, his criterion is too late. If it's industrial wage labour, then he's too early. The transition in England towards wage labour was much earlier and much longer than Marx suggested. What about the creation of large corporations? Do they show the rise of capitalism? Of course, corporations are important in modern capitalism, but again, focusing on England, the United Kingdom, the corporation is a relatively late takeoff. The corporations existed before. We had the Hudson Bay Corporation, the East India Corporation, founded in the 16th century. But these are relatively few, very powerful, but relatively few. The growth of numerous industrial corporations is really late 19th century. So corporations are important, but they do not demarcate capitalism. They don't give us a key institutional change in the 18th century, which marks the rise of capitalism. Okay, the answer to that question, what are the key institutional changes in the 18th century, I think is a clue here, a clue from Schumpeter. So this is more to do with Schumpeter than it is, in a sense, to Marx. Because Schumpeter emphasized the importance of the financial system in capitalism. And he says the development of the law and practice of negotiable paper and created stock deposits afford the best indication we have for dating the rise of capitalism. By negotiable paper, he means trade in IOUs, bills of exchange, things we take for granted like banknotes, okay? A banknote, we trust in it, we use it, and people accept it because it's backed by legal authority and by convention. And it's just a piece of paper. So why do people accept it? Because they know it's going to be recognized as something else. And these were huge institutional revolutions. Before this happened, to trade you needed precious metals. You needed gold or silver, which you had to carry around. okay? And so trading in Europe was often a dangerous thing of carting around bags of coin, precious coin, gold or silver, to make trade possible over reasonable distances. And of course the risk, of course, was bandits getting robbed, losing the money, which frequently happened. So people devised things like banks and bills of exchange as mechanisms to deal with this security problem, and which of course speeded up the whole process. Now these things were invented long before, but they took off in the 18th century. So what are those key institutional developments? Well, the first one was, we're focusing on Britain, the rise of British capitalism. The first thing is the financial revolution of the early 1700s. And Douglas North also focuses on this, but I think it's, but he sees its reason, the reason for this financial revolution is occurring because of the change of the relationship of power between King and Parliament when the Dutch invasion of 1688 occurs and James II is deposed and William III and Mary become joint monarchs of the United Kingdom. And that and the alleged greater security of property rights for North is the underpinning of this financial revolution. I think to some extent that's true, but I would actually emphasize something else behind it. The financial revolution was prompted by the need to fight war. Okay? War is often the midwife of institutional change. Okay? Regrettably, because war is destructive and horrible. Innocent people die and it's a waste of resources and so on. War is often the midwife of institutional change. And what happened in 1688 is that before then, for a long time, Britain was allied with France and Spain. The reason why William of Orange successfully invaded, with the support of a lot of the population, was religious, okay? It's because James II was suspected of wanting to bring back Catholicism, and by then the clear majority of the population in Britain were Protestant. So William of Orange comes in and comes from Holland and establishes power and overturns Britain's former political alliances. And so for the next 70 years, more than half the time, Britain is at war, fighting France and Spain either simultaneously or alternately. Okay? And this ends with the 7 Years' War, which in a sense is the first global war, mainly between Britain and France. It takes place in North America, in India, and various other parts of the world. It's a global war. To fight a war in those times, as today, you need money. You need to raise armies, you need to pay the army, you need munitions. Already there was artillery, already the navy was very important, you had to build boats. And this was a huge stimulus, not just to the economy, the demands of war, but to set up a financial system to finance it. And the fact that Parliament and the Sovereign got together was also important for that, because previously there was always disputes. The Sovereign, the King tries to raise money, Parliament says no, or it's too much. That created a civil war in the 1640s, that very question. This conjoining of the interests of King and Parliament in 1688 meant that that problem was partially solved and war finance could get underway, and it was needed for much of that period. So you have a rise in administration, a rise in financial revolution, creation of the Bank of England to help finance war projects in 1694 and so on. And this also develops private finance as well. So state finance grows with the Bank of England, and private banks and private finance develops as well in this period, and involves key legal rules for the buying and selling of debt. Private banks buttressed by the Bank of England, so this conjoining of public finance and private finance. Now, why is the buying and selling of debt important? Well, there's someone who thought it was very important. If we're asked who made the discovery which has most deeply affected the fortunes of the human race, we think, after consideration, we must safely answer the man who first discovered that debt is a safely saleable commodity. We don't know that person. Okay? A lot of these institutional innovations took place by committees, and we don't know the individuals involved. But this was a huge innovation. It not only gives rise to banknotes, but it means that you can do trade in derivative assets and not just first order assets. But it was complicated. It didn't happen easily. This was attempted hundreds of years before, but never made secure. The problem with it was to create a legal system that would enforce contracts involving the sale of debt. Now, if I borrow $100 from you, okay, and I give you an IOU for $100, and here I've got this $100 and I've got my debt to you, and you have this piece of paper, an IOU, and you say, well, I'm a bit short of money, I'm not going to get it back from Hodgson, he's a bit slow paying back this money, I'll try and sell this IOU, okay, so try and sell it to the next person, maybe for $90, because you know that you won't get the full $100 for it, and then that can be sold on, sold on, sold on, sold on. Okay, this is a legal dispute. Okay, let's assume that the $100 I received, you stole from someone else. So someone else says, those are my $100, you stole from me. Does that mean the contract you made with him is invalid? Okay. The common law courts couldn't sort that out. There had to be statutes put on through Parliament to say, no, it doesn't matter where the money came from and whether it was stolen or not. This is still a valid contract with an IOU. Okay? And it's a contract over a promise. Okay, the piece of IOU being traded is not a promise, not a contract to deliver a good or service. It's a contract about a promise that I made to pay back the money that I borrowed from you. Okay, so this was a novelty of all this, meant that the law had to be developed to deal with it, and it's still being refined to deal with these questions. And we got record of all the statutes that occurred in the 18th century on this. Okay, this gets us towards a definition of capitalism. Okay, and as the introduction says, I do emphasise the importance of the legal system, because you cannot understand capitalism simply by social classes. Social classes like workers and capitalists are important as elements of the general picture, but we also need to know how rules are enforced, and law is part of that. It's not all the story, but it's part of it. So you need a legal system supporting widespread individual rights, liberties, including to own, buy and sell private property. So that's a kind of extension or reinforcement or refinement of the private property criterion. Secondly, widespread commodity exchange in markets involving money. Again, that's a refinement of the markets bit of the definition. But that wouldn't be enough, okay, because those things have existed on and off various parts of the world for thousands of years. Likewise, with widespread ownership, private ownership means production, by firms producing goods or services for sale in the pursuit of profit. And that would really go with 4, which is a Weberian criterion, much of production organised separately and apart from the home and family. Those two really go together. We're talking about private enterprise, which is not household enterprise. Okay? And again, these 4 things wouldn't give us the key defining moment of the rise of capitalism. They're essential characteristics of capitalism, and they're important to put in the definition, but they're not sufficient. We need more. Okay, so what I've pointed to is a gap here, is this element here. A developed financial system with banking institutions, a widespread property, collateral, and the selling of debt. Okay? That we know gets really well developed. Starts getting developed in Italy and the Netherlands before, but really takes off in the British system in the 18th century. Okay, and that, with the other ones, demarcates the starting point for capitalism. And we can leave it there. We've got 5 criteria, and we can leave those together, and that's a good definition of capitalism. Okay. I'm arguing that this one is essential because it focuses us on the key financial institutions. And once we understand the importance of this, analytically, processes like collateralization become important for understanding the growth of inequality in capitalism. What is it about the dynamic in capitalism that leads to rising inequality? So that isn't the definition I defend, but I also want to suggest we might want to fill in this one as well, okay? And this is a kind of option, if you like, and this is, while this one is inspired by Schumpeter, number 5 is inspired by Marx, okay? Widespread wage labour and employment contracts. Okay, why am I adding that one? I'm adding it for an important reason. While Marx was wrong about wage labour being able to clearly define a starting point for capitalism, I think there's something about the nature of capitalism, as we know it at least, makes wage labour important. I mean, the fact is that most of us are employees, okay? A minority are self-employed or retired or capitalists, but most people earning a living under capitalism, the vast majority are employees. They're working in an employment relationship. Now, in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, you experimented with an alternative, okay? One experiment, an alternative, was the Soviet Union, but you still had employment contracts in the Soviet Union, okay? The alternative in the Soviet Union was to get rid of the private property, not to get rid of the employment contract. What you did in the former Yugoslavia was to promote worker cooperatives, okay? And technically, worker cooperatives, you're not an employee, you're a share owner. I think there were complications in the Yugoslav system, and perhaps you can tell me more about that. But worker cooperatives, when workers own the firm or own shares in the firm, they cease to be employees of the firm. The firm can also employ people who are not shareholders, or it can employ shareholders in an employment capacity, but the workers don't have to be employees to work in the firm. They collectively decide the rules, they own shares in the firm, and so that's an important different system. If we're imagining a future for capitalism, I think one of the areas in which capitalism has changed enormously and could change in the future is in this area. Because employment contracts under capitalism used to be virtual servitude, okay? An employer would have a legal right to whip you, okay? You could be transported to the colonies if you fled work, if you didn't turn up at work, you could be fined. All these things were there in the early years of industrial capitalism. The employment contract, most countries, most developed countries having some welfare system and employment law, protects employers, gives them rights which didn't exist before. But we can also imagine transformations, new cooperatives, new arrangements, a growth in self-employment, for example, which may change the nature of capitalism. So it's an optional here to actually put that in as a demarcating characteristic. And then these two things are historic, what I call bookends, the beginning and the end. The beginning is marked by this, the financial system, and the end is marked by, or the possibility of an end of capitalism is marked by a change there. Okay, it's optional, it's just an argument, a way of looking at it. Okay, so to conclude, first, just to reiterate what I said before, definitions are serving this demarcation task. In this case, historical demarcation between one preceding systems and later systems. They're not themselves analytical on analyses or descriptions, but they can actually lead us in certain directions. Said all that before. Definitions are often fuzzy, okay? I focused on the British case because that's the paradigm. It's the same case that Marx focused on it for the same reason. It's the first fully developed capitalist system. And we have parts of the world where capitalism is semi-developed. Okay, I mean, in parts of Africa, China is not boundary case. To what extent has it got a capitalist financial system? Big question, we could discuss that. Definitions are often fuzzy, just as they are in the biological world. Classification has fuzzy boundaries. But this doesn't mean that the active definition is unimportant, because definitions, as Weber said, are like ideal types. They give you not only classify, but give you a point of focus against which you can compare reality. There's no fixed toolkit for making definitions. It's very much a matter of judgment and debate, but it's essential. It's essential because science is a social process, and science involves communication. And if we're to understand capitalism, we should have some consensus and some understanding about what we're talking about when we use the C word. When we use capitalism as a word, what are we talking about? So you know roughly what I'm talking about. I hope it's clear. Maybe I'm not clear enough. Maybe my definition could be improved. But you know roughly what I'm talking about. We can discuss the adequacy of my argument. But at least from this point, we can move forward, hopefully, to analyse what we're talking about. And that's the next step. Right? So capitalism in this way can be defined as an historically specific system, fully emerging sometime in the 1700s. And to illustrate briefly the importance of this, let's ask some questions about capitalism. The questions depend, when asking key questions, the questions will depend on the definition. So a question like the source of inequality, okay? We have clear data that the rise of capitalism is associated with the rise of inequality. Of course, there was inequality before. In feudal Europe, there was huge inequality of power and wealth. But actually gets greater. Inequality gets greater from 1700. Interestingly, the rate of growth of inequality slows down, according to Milanovich's data. It's still increasing, and it's quite a complex picture, because if you read Piketty's book on capital in the 21st century, the progress of inequality in different countries is different from case to case, depending on circumstances. But the key analytical question is, what are the drivers of enhanced inequality under capitalism? Okay? So if you're making a claim that capitalism is problematic in some sense with regard to inequality, and that would be a reasonable claim given the data from Milanovic, the question must be then, what is it about capitalism that drives inequality? And the answer can't be things like, well, it's inheritance, isn't it? Yes, a lot of inequality is due to inheritance. A lot of wealth is inherited, okay? But that doesn't give you the answer about capitalism, okay? It's an important mechanism which occurs within capitalism by which wealth is passed on, but it tells you nothing specific about capitalism, about the way in which capitalism in particular makes inequality worse or less, okay? Because inheritance of wealth occurred in feudal times, okay? Before capitalism. So while inheritance is important as a mechanism to understand real empirical inequality, we also need to answer this question as well as that, right? As well as the inheritance question. What is it about capitalism that generates greater inequality? This is a question that Marx implicitly at least talked about when he talks about the theory of surplus value, extracting surplus value from workers. That's a theory of extraction, a theory of the generation of inequality. Can it be markets? Well, that's a bad answer, because markets may have something to do with the process, but they've existed for thousands of years. They cannot answer this question. What's specific about capitalism that drives inequality? Okay. Tomorrow I'll discuss this, about this question, and the answer briefly is differential collateralizability. If you're a worker, you can't mortgage your labour power. Okay? If you're a capitalist, you can. If a capitalist with real or intangible assets, with factories, land, patents, these things, that can go to the bank, borrow money on the basis of those things, and invest in more projects and keep those assets at the same time. Okay? So they can kind of double their money, they can endlessly reinvest on the basis of a collateralization principle. But As a worker, you can't. If you were a slave, your master could collateralize you. Okay, slaves were collateralized. People borrowed money on the basis of the slaves they owned. But because we're not slaves, neither our masters nor ourselves can collateralize our labor. Okay? If you're a student, you can get a loan from the bank, maybe because you've got greater earnings power down the road, but that's what's called an unsecured loan. Okay? It's not a secured loan because they can't enslave you if you don't pay back that loan from the bank after you've studied and got your degree. Okay? So we have a story about the mechanism which is based on the definition, and begin to answer this question here. It can't be markets because that doesn't relate to capitalism itself. Okay. Another big question: can and should capitalism be superseded? Well, obviously, it depends on what you mean by capitalism. Okay. I mean, there are some varieties of Marxists who believe that argue that the Soviet Union was state capitalist. I don't know if you've heard of these arcane Marxist arguments. Okay. So there's, I can remember from my youth, leftist youth in the UK, there was the Maoists, the Mao's China, there was the Soviet-style communists, and there were varieties of Trotskyists who used to split and feud and divide and so on. And within the Trotskyists, there was a group who believed it was all capitalist. Okay, so the Soviet Union was capitalist, Mao's China was capitalist, the West was capitalist. So we're against all of it. Okay, so which is in some ways an attractive position, because there's things wrong with the West and there's things wrong with the Soviet Union and Mao's China, and because you're against all of it, you can be pure. Okay, you can say, well, I'm not backing any of them. Okay, analytically, though, the problem with that is it's difficult to know what point to a supersession, an example, a real-world example of a possibility beyond capitalism. So if you define capitalism more narrowly, which I would prefer, I would prefer to say that the Soviet Union was not capitalist, it's a different kind of system. It all depends on the definition of capitalism that you use. Okay, so to sum up, I've argued for a particular definition. I began to talk about mechanisms within capitalism. I'm willing to talk more about that. But at least I hope I've impressed upon you that having some consensus of argument and some notion of the importance of definition is a really important preliminary task for understanding capitalism. And this is about, from the early chapters of my book, and my book is much more about the other things too, but I'm very willing to talk about things that flow from this, so thank you for your time.